Excellent. Well, hello, everyone. I want to thank the Satanic Estate for having us back. Thank you so much. We're always super humbled to be asked to do things, but definitely to be asked back. So thank you so much.
And on top of wanting to say thank you so much, we want to say thank you to Morbidly Beautiful, which is our podcast, home, and network, as well as family. And just to remind everyone, Morbidly Beautiful is your McCall home away from home with horror news, reviews, editorials, and more. And they support everyone in the horror community with special effects, artists, indie filmmakers, writers, women, LGBTQ folks, and so much more. And we've been really happy to be part of the spooky team for almost 2 years now. And we really would encourage people to go and visit them at morbidlybeautiful.com to check out all the more great content that they have.
Thank you, Jess. So welcome, folks, to I Spin on Your Podcast, a monthly horror podcast brought to you by the Spinsters of Horror. This is the time once a month where Jess puts down her bloody knitting needles and I step away from the TV to discuss horror movies and sometimes other horror mediums with thoughtful analysis, research, and passion.
So, as we all know, I am Jess.
I'm Kelly.
And we flew our broomsticks in the horror scene of July of 2018 to assist in filling the void of female voices in podcasting with our show, I Spin on Your Podcast. As women, we knew that the genre was dominated by the masculine perspective, so we felt like it was important to celebrate and encourage female horror fans while at the same time remaining inclusive to all who love horror has to offer. So if you can find me behind the scenes editing and crafting, while Kelly is normally found in her dark basement with a black mug of coffee, on heading up our social media, and we're really excited to be here.
Excellent. So for today's live presentation and live episode, we're going to be talking about the monstrous female vampire. So historically, female vampires were portrayed as predatory lesbians or as subservient to a master in the form of Dracula. They were the brides, a means to bring victims to the male vampire. Modernized versions of the brides have them liberated from any master and are unconventional women fighting the patriarchy and the traditions that try to keep them submissive. Through the films Byzantium from 2017, Bit 2019, and Bliss also from 2019, we see the full spectrum of these women. We see the rise of Carmilla. So pick your poison and listen on if you dare. So first off, we're going to get started talking about Carmilla. Here's our little book here, and folks that will be listening later. Here's the nicely short novella. This is the lesbian vampire story that came before Dracula. So Dracula was actually written 1897. Carmilla was written 1871. So this book, if you haven't read it, briefly, it's a first-person account from a woman named Laura, a young English woman who falls prey to a beautiful vampire. It's also written in the first-person account, kind of like how Stoker's novel was. But it's a story of two females with definite lesbian coding. We couldn't have outright lesbianism in 1871, could we?
Well, no, because this novel looks at these anxieties that are often surrounding female sexuality. So back in the time that novel would have been written, a lot of young women would have had very close and intimate relationships, and they could sometimes be coded as queer, but that was not necessarily the case. That was just the only time women ever had any companionship was through other women. So by bringing that idea of relationships between women, very close intimate relationships between women together, you get this concept of this woman named Carmilla, who brings out these anxieties around female sexuality, because she's not only just a predator of men, she's also a predator of women. And this would make the lesbian vampire scary.
Ooh, yes. So throughout like literature for female vampires, cinema and female vampires, which we'll talk about movies a little bit later on, the predatory lesbian was unfortunately such a common trope. Carmilla herself, throughout this book anyways, seems pretty disinterested in men, at least sexually. She kills and lures in young women. So she is a predator, and she does seem to be shrouded in this taboo sexuality of lesbianism. And the lesbian, especially way back when, was a woman that was crossing many boundaries, many taboos of what was, societally accepted sexuality. So she was deviant, abhorrent, an abomination, because that was a very Christian, organized society. And that was not sexually accepted sexuality, right? What was okay back then? To be married, to procreate, and have heterosexual sexuality. But for Carmilla, our unconventional woman, she's non-procreative, she's unmarried, and so it seems she's a homosexual.
Right. And this rise of this renewed interest in vampires in the 19th century is often linked to this idea of sex and power. And female vampires are very prominent in this. And Carmilla was a great example of this figure because she comes out as this self-fetishizing predator. She's not only going after other women just to sustain her life and her immortality, she's going after what she believes are reflections of herself. She's acting out her own murder over and over and over again just to almost feed her own bloodlust. And this is like this acting out this like fantasy of constant, embracement of immortality, but through the ideas of the women, right? And through the ideas of a woman, through a relationship through another woman on top of that as well.
And that is actually a really old concept. I don't think it's super common now, but a really old theme and an old concept in books and movies that homosexuals, lesbians were actually narcissists that really just wanted to make love to their reflections, right? And Carmilla would fit into that trope because they're young women like herself, well, when she died and became a vampire anyways. So lesbians around this time, they were very morbid and they were decadent. They were rich and they seduced the very youthful and powerless women.
And whenever we talk back in those times when they were ever talking in types of lesbian women or any type of intimate relationship between women, is often they're considered female predators, which is often what the female vampire is often related to. She's not only linked to overt sexual expression, she is a female predator. She is the mother of evil. She is all fallen women, and she strikes fear in the heart of men. And they're often depicted more sexualized creatures than male vampires because they're lustful and they're all about defiling.
Absolutely. And we actually, it's a very early episode of ours, episode 3, where we talk about vampiric sexuality. It was one of my old favorites, but we did touch upon this with about, Victorian sexuality, Dracula and female vampires. So take a listen to that if you would like. But the female vampire, this female predator. So we'll go back to lesbianism, which vampires were often seen as back then. But lesbians, because they were seen so monstrous in literature and in film, they were showing us that, lesbians were monsters, essentially, to put it honestly and bluntly. So it was like this warning to women. So beware homosexuality, there's deadly consequences, but also showing lesbians as these monstrous, deviant predators that are out just to kill and victimize our women. It alleviated the male fears about homosexuality because they were worried like, lesbians, they threaten our ego and our masculinity. They're going to take our women away. But if they're monsters, they're not going to do that, but we're going to kill them for sure.
And then another concept that increases that monstrosity of the female vampire is that she's literally an undead corpse. She's living between life and death, and they crave nothing but human blood. She is part of the object, and women are constantly associated with that which is object, which is monstrous. The female vampire is always increasing that objection by having this bloodlust that drives her to stalk her prey in the night, to be kind of very sexual with her prey, and also feed off of them in terms of like nourishing herself, but she ends up also nourishing others as she brings more into her fold.
Absolutely. So essentially, Camilla's like the subversion of the heteronormative and male-centered world to which vampires were kind of constricted to and put into this box after Dracula. Because once we see Dracula, we see his brides. Definitely in Dracula, in Dracula, the first Dracula movie, minus Nosferatu, who is very solo. Dracula had his brides and got to feed off vermin, and was given humans if he so desired. He was in control, but Carmilla is in control. And we always forget about this very important story for female vampires and, female monsters overall.
Yeah, because she was the first female vampire to have her own agency and to be in control of her own not only just body, but also her own mission and seeking her own food. When we, like Kelly had brought, exactly, Destiny. Like, as you brought up already, how important it was. When we see female vampires 28 years later with Dracula, we see them as the brides. They're under they're under their master's control. They're also forced to wait to feed when he says is okay. And when they do feed, they're only allowed to feed on that of children, which we can also go back all the way back to Lilith. But It is a sense of control. These female vampires stay in a state of control, and we've seen this. This continues on as a trend throughout the 70s, like the 60s, the 70s, 80s, getting into the 90s. Our female vampires don't have much agency, and we lose that idea of Carmilla and being a solo vampire on her own, hunting and going for prey and finding a connection with someone. But then we start getting into the 2000s, and the female vampire changes. She takes back that agency, and all of a sudden we're starting to see stories of female vampires who are not only on their own, they're not answering to a master, and when they are answering to a master, they're fighting back. They're literally taking back the night as creatures.
Absolutely. As creatures of the night. And I just wanted to read a short passage from the book. This is Spinster's reading time. And literature from the 1800s is quite different. But Laura, our protagonist of the story, who is a victim of Carmilla in a lot of ways, but in other ways, they were like greatest friends. They became very close physically and emotionally. And so it's a very interesting story. Sometimes after an hour of apathy, my strange and beautiful companion would take my hand and hold it with a fond pressure, renewed again and again, blushing softly, gazing in my face with languid and burning eyes, and breathing so fast that her dress rose and fell with a tumultuous respiration. It was like the ardor of a lover. It embarrassed me. It was hateful and yet overpowering. And with gloating eyes, she drew me to her, and her hot lips traveled along my cheek in kisses, and she would whisper, almost in sobs, "You are mine. You shall be mine. You and I are one forever." So it's very just like passionate, but obsessive, and she's a monster. So Laura's like actually quite attracted to this woman. She's attracted to Carmilla, but she's also very repulsed by Carmilla, and that is that. And there's a lot you could even read. We're not going to go into the queer aspect of this per se, but there's a lot in that passage in itself about the female vampire and where she's a predatory lesbian. And we see that. So the other agent of chaos, we'll say, is Lilith. And I know a lot of things come back to Lilith, a lot of our research, a lot of the things that we talk about, but a lot of things stem back to her. She is the mother of evil. She's the archetype, and that she's Adam's first disobedient wife, right? Twice Lilith called upon God to free her from her subservience to Adam. And her punishment was that she would have to kill her own children. But she accepted this punishment in return for her freedom. And she was fine with killing her own children, right? She preferred the death of her own children over having to return to Adam and obey her. Her freedom was much more important to her.
And I always get into Lilith every time we have these conversations, because Lilith is the OG female vampire. Like Kelly said, she refused to allow Adam to control her and to let her engage, and she left him to engage with demons. And by rejecting God and Adam, she was forced to take on the mantle of the demon. She became our first female vampire by seeking out the blood of the infants. And I know that this carries on later on with our brides. They're always will be seen as the mothers of evil. And, you know, and Lilith was part of birthing evil by birthing hundreds of demons, because she was always be that bridal woman who had unbridled promiscuity, and she was promiscuous with all these other demons, and has colored her as a very demonic, very fallen, very untrustworthy women, the mother of evil. And thus that mantle gets placed onto female vampires, because they are thus similar, right? And they are thus the same abject figure, the same mother who eats her own children.
Another anti-mother will say, which I enjoy, but our patriarchal narrative says that rebellious women are not allowed to take part in any normal feminine behaviors, especially not motherhood, because you're not a good woman if you're not a mother. And a vampire cannot create life, technically, I guess in the normal way, right? Women cannot be created equal. Lilith was not seen as equal, because in kind of Christian mythology and a lot of those different types of like Western religions, women were not equal. We've been repressed for centuries. So, you know, Lilith's path was essentially straight to rebellion, and then of course damnation. She felt free, but a rebellious spirit, like our female vampire, and that's like the heart of the female vampire, is about rebellion, freedom, autonomy.
Yeah, it's transformation, and it's important to a vampire. The lady vampire, she's active and she's independent in her own narrative, which is always so crucial and important when it comes to that of the female vampire. She is a career woman. She is out there searching for love, hunting for blood, just the whole nature of immortality. She has goals and resources, and she's free to not prescribe to any kind of, patriarchal, sexual, or social morals. She is her own woman, and she will go out. However, but we're only seeing this narrative now in the last almost 10, 15 years. We haven't seen that narrative before. She was constantly always the bride, the one who was subservient to her master.
Mm-hmm. And so getting into female vampires in cinema, generally speaking, so they're often portrayed as, again, the female predator, like Carmilla, or the lesbian vampire, the mother of evil, Lilith, a rebellious demoness, or the fallen woman. We're a sex worker, we're a public woman, we are to be shamed, that type of thing. But they're lustful, they're defiling creatures. And like Jess said, if you see any vampire movies from the 70s, we're because I'm a vampire. We are tonight, folks. Hyper sexualized. And Carmilla kind of started that trend of just literally, like I read in here, the big, full, red, wet lips, and big eyes, and their heaving bosoms, and they're always in some kind of negligee that's revealing, and everything's very just kind of penetrative, and sexual by just the biting of the neck and being a vampire, and especially if it's female on female, because, well, we don't need to get into the male gaze, but of course that's prevalent in a lot of those vampire movies from the 70s, and still just generally in a lot of female vampire movies, not in the ones that we will be talking about tonight, though, thankfully.
Yes.
The last thing I'll say, one of the things is the thing about, you said vampirism is transformative, right? Becoming a vampire for these women, especially in the movies we'll talk about, provides, bodily autonomy, freedom. There's this wonderful power in being something that's not our typical brides, right? These are independent vampires, like you said, in charge of their own story, in charge of their own destiny. And what is more fearful than an ambitious woman that's out there, very confident, subverting all these really terrible misogynistic attitudes towards women, and just putting herself out in the world and doing whatever she wants? She definitely has to be kill them. But cinematically, all this started with Dracula's daughter in 1936, also a predatory lesbian, but that's 1936, right?
So do we want to get into our movies for?
Absolutely. So like I said, a lot of early works were really stemming from Carmilla. They could be seen as misogynistic and anti-lesbian, but these films challenge all kinds of tropes. And we'll see the rise of a new type of Carmilla. And so the first movie we're going to talk about is Byzantium. So just a brief synopsis that I'll give about all of the movies. So for Byzantium, mayhem follows when two female vampires, a mother and daughter, are running from a kindred group and take refuge at a seaside British community.
So Byzantium. When I first saw this film about a year ago, I loved it because it was a new idea of the concept of women in vampiric women in a horror movie. And what's really interesting is the name of the film. So Kelly and I were like, Byzantium, let's kind of go back and look a little bit as to why we would call a film such as this. Why would it be important? It's particularly in the tales of these two women, Clara and her daughter Ella, but we are going to focus on the female vampire, Clara. So in a brief little history about women in Byzantium, what did you expect? Women were expected to learn domestic duties and encouraged not to learn or to read. It was either get married or go and live in a convent. You're a wife or you're none. Sounds familiar, right? Women were not considered equal. They were property. Yep, that runs with that too. But then one of the things that was most really interesting to me was how women were treated in Byzantium was often men really appreciated the female charm, but they felt that this was better used in the services of prostitution and being mistresses, and that any kind of moral purity for a woman was reserved for family female members only. So prostitutes were at the bottom of the social ladder. They were known as public women, and they were often treated like slaves and prisoners. And then eventually mistresses of brothels would go around buying girls from poor families, even though this was illegal, so that they can fill those brothels for all the men who are looking for those various mistresses and prostitutes. And this is interesting because in our movie, Clara comes from this time period, and she was herself plucked from the beach and literally sold into prostitution by a soldier who's like, this will be my mistress. And her life as a prostitute in that story begins. But then she ends up taking that narrative and making it something her own.
Absolutely. So the movie is called Byzantium, but the refuge that is like the main one that you see in the movie it's an old hotel that's nothing's really being done with it, called the Byzantium. Yeah. So it's highly, highly significant for the overall themes of this movie. So Clara, she's our Carmilla character, but her story and her history, is very, very it's important. It's tragic. It's devastating. So there was, like Jess said, she was plucked off of the beach by, we're going to call him the captain, because I don't even think he necessarily has a name, but he doesn't need a name. He doesn't deserve a name.
Johnny Lee Miller.
There we go. Fine. The captain takes her, puts her into a brothel, is probably like 16 years old. Yeah, that's where she lives and she grows up. And he regularly visits her, beats her, rapes her, brutalizes her for years and years and years. But he says to her, I've given you your profession. Enjoy your life, whore. I was like, okay, mental note on what's going to happen to you later on. But it's terrible. But, as she grows up through this, she's taught essentially sexuality as performance. She becomes very good. And the actress that plays her is stunningly beautiful. And so when she becomes an adult, this is all she knows how to do, right? Because she grew up in this time and she doesn't know how to really do anything else, but she also does this very, very well. She's very good with people. She's very good with men. She understands men. I think if you spend a decade in a brothel with tons and tons of men, you learn a lot about them and their wants, desires, and just how they work.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And her story is really interesting because so she's put into this life of prostitution by the captain, and she's having to learn to navigate how to survive and live her life on top of dying of tuberculosis at the same time too. Yep. She is determined to live, and her determination to live comes from the fact that she has had a child and she has given birth to her daughter. And instead of back in the time whenever you could not have children within a brothel because you can just not have that's bad for business. Often these children were even left for adoption or murdered. And she gave the child up for adoption and used her everything in her power to be able to help Ella become raised and as a young girl, stuff like that, until she is to the point of almost death and she has to make a really big decision. And I think what Clara does is amazing. And that's take the gift of eternal life.
Yeah, absolutely. She sees the opportunity to essentially save herself and get her daughter back. So there is in this movie, the Brotherhood, and the Brotherhood is only of male vampires. Nobody female could ever become a vampire. So she steals the map from them to become a vampire. And like you said, she's dying. She's desperate. This is her way out. This is her salvation. And so she goes to become reborn and gain so much power that she didn't have before. So her character is slightly reminiscent of Darla from Angel and Buffy that I like a lot. Darla was a dying prostitute from syphilis and she wasn't well. She becomes a vampire and she just enjoys her life again, says, because we know women, generally speaking, we don't have a lot of power, but then once the Brotherhood finds out that she's gone and stolen the map and become a vampire, they're not impressed. So there's this wonderful, wonderful scene where, they found out that she's a vampire and they say, what's her parentage? It's low. What's her job? And she says, harlot. Mm-hmm. And she asked them, and I love this part of the movie so much. And this is, I think, where a lot of the power is. And then because throughout the movie, you slowly get little hints of Clara's story and why she is the way she is. Why is she on the run all the time? Why do her and her daughter have to keep moving? It's because she's running from the Brotherhood. So Clara asked them, like, well, what do you do? Like, what is this? And he's like, we are the pointed nails of justice. And they ask her, like, well, what are you going to do with this gift? And she says, punish those who prey on the weak and to curb the power of men.
Yes. I grabbed that line too when that came out, because exactly the way they treat her in that moment is from the onset, they call her base. And already her sex and her class is being used against her because they're like, you're going to besmirch our vampiric lineage. We only take in men of noble lineage so that we can control what's going on in the world, kind of that like a vampire Illuminati type idea. And she, as a woman, is coming in, they're just like, we can't trust you. And she's like, yeah, well, I can't trust you either. So I'm going to use my abilities to be able to help those who are put into terrible positions like I did myself. And that's what Clara does as a vampire. She is always out there helping those who are not in the best situations with what she knows how to do. Like we do see her take women off the streets, and she does run a brothel herself, but she does it in a way that's safe for them. And she's
absolutely
to protect them.
There's this other little point that I think we should move on, but there's this point where, yes, she wants to help other women. She was this woman before 100 years ago. Like she totally understands their plight, but she kills the local pimp and says to him, the world will be a more beautiful place without you in it.
Yes. And she says that quite a few times. And I love that because, she is a female avenger, a vampiric avenger. She's understand that she's been given this gift of immortality. She's not squandering it. She's like, I'm embracing this. I've embraced this lifestyle as a vampire because I have this ability to be able to enact vengeance on the men who will hurt and abuse and use other women, just as it's happened to me, just as it happened to my daughter. And this is why Clara is like this Carmilla figure, because she's also a mother, but she is ruthless and she's merciless in her killing. And like some of the kills in this movie, I'm just like, yes. Go
they're
Clara.
Pretty brutal. Like they're pretty bloody. They're quite brutal. And well, she has been raised to survive. And so that's what she has to do, even now as a vampire. Thankfully, we've got a lot of vampire strength and things like that. But she's got to do what she can to protect herself. And I think that's also in essence of what Carmilla is like as well. We have to protect ourselves, but we know that we are also a vampire. So we got to get the blood somehow.
You need to accept that your new nature of what you are now, but you can use that ability to help others instead of being under the subservience of men. And
absolutely,
like I said, the Brotherhood, they wanted to control her, and that's what they wanted to do. They either control or destroy her. If we can't control you, we destroy you. And that's what happens often with a female vampire. They're usually the first to go in every kind of vampire hunt.
Absolutely. Should we move on to our second movie?
I was going to say, I'm like, this is the perfect time to jump into the film Bit, because here's what happens when you hunt female vampires.
Yeah, they come after you.
Fight back.
So Bit from 2019, a synopsis for this one. A transgender 18-year-old woman on summer vacation in Los Angeles fights to survive after she falls in with 4 queer feminist vampires who try to rid the city streets of predatory men. And this is one of my favorite vampire movies. And this is my favorite out of the 3 that we'll talk about tonight. Our Camilla character that we're going to focus on tonight is Duke. Because Duke, who is my hero, she was literally a bride of the Dracula type character and figure in this named Vlad. She is a reformed and super pissed off bride. And I understand why she's so pissed off. And there's portion of it that probably kind of clouds her vision and makes her overall like destiny and goals in life a little bit short-sighted, but I still absolutely understand where she is coming from. Duke envisions a world where all women are vampires. And so she's this woman that created a girl gang to subvert the brides of old. So instead of finding women to enslave and serve like Vlad did, she finds women who need and deserve the power and creates this wonderful gang of young women. So we either call it the V Squad, Bike Club, Bit Girls, whatever you want.
Right. And this group of women are all women who are from marginalized communities, or all women who have experienced some form of othering or alienation in their previous human lives, and but now as a vampire they have that ability and a power to be able to protect themselves and protect other women who are in other situations. And Bit is a really interesting film because the theme is about power. It is about these internal struggles that we have in taking control of one's identity and moving away from the feeling of powerlessness. And that's what happened to Duke. What's so important about Duke's character is when she talks about her story and why she has her vision and her mission, it's because when she came to town to the 70s and to the 80s, to the 70s to New York as a young girl, she moved into prostitution to be able to survive, but eventually to live her own life, which was to be a queer woman in the 1980s. And this was something she was completely 100% so happy and so proud of, that she had done this hard work. And then all of a sudden this male vampire comes along and literally glamours her to be someone completely different. He literally uses glamour and essentially, I will say, like
mind control.
He mind controls her to be a heteronormative woman, female vampire in his group of women that he's collected over the years. And Duke is pissed when she figures that out, when she finds that opportunity, that moment that his glamour power is not strong enough to keep her from remembering who she is. She's like, oh shit, I have my opportunity. I need to take power back. I need to take my control back. And that's what she does when she has her moment with the first bride and they take down Vlad. And then she goes out with the rule, like, no fucking boys and no glamoring.
Yeah, absolutely. She forever is punishing trash men because she's forever punishing Vlad and angry about Vlad. He literally stole her life. He stole her identity as a queer woman and made her this subservient slave and side piece. Like, he had 3 brides, classic, but kept her blinded for decades, in her words, to service his every depravity. So absolutely, our power is taken away, our autonomy is taken away. That's like our old brides from 18th, 19th century. They're just window dressing and a means to the end. Like I said, you start seeing this in Dracula, the film, in 1931. The brides are really not there to do anything besides look nice or lure victims to the master, which, again, Duke had to do. So she is in control of this girl gang, and she wants freedom and equality. There's not maybe 100% equality in it. That happens with Laurel, who is another excellent, the transgendered character in that movie. But, Duke has 0 patience for men. And what I love this movie. I think, Jess, you were saying earlier, or off camera, I guess you could say, but yes, Duke is, has a kind of this similar interesting upbringing as Clara from Byzantium, right? Very troubled early life, very, very struggling and everything, and goes into sex work because of really no option. It's easy, and Duke is really good at it. And she's like, a means to the end, essentially. Her sex work was a means to an end. She wasn't forced into it, a means to the end. And it got to a point where she was finally able to be herself, and that was absolutely taken away. So Duke kills Vlad, like you said, takes a moment and consumes him piece by piece as he consumed her.
And like Clara and Duke, like Clara, they're both of them are ruthless. They have their rules, but they are merciless. And this is because they have experience and understand what men having knowledge, like secret knowledge of something and power is like, and how damaging it could be to other groups and to women in particular. Like, when men hold power, we're in danger because we can't fight against it. We have no ability to. And if we try to, we get glamored, we get gaslit into believing something else or something completely different to follow our master's wills and every, like you said, every depravity. And that's what she did for Vlad. But now when she has her opportunity, she's like, oh no, we're not going back. And yes, we understand that she is a little more stubborn in her beliefs that, like, nope, fuck, men are bad. All this is bad. We can't have this. Men will churn. They will be a power. And we like, okay, yes, Laurel comes in the picture to try and help change that narrative, but Duke's narrative is just still as important and inspiring for other women and other female vampire characters to come out and say, I can be strong, I can be powerless, I can be powerful, I can be ruthless and still have a good heart, which is the same story for Carmilla, and it's the same story for Clara. They are still good women, they're still good people. They just know that they have these abilities now to be able to help others.
Absolutely. And the helping others is definitely another common thread between those 2 women, those 2 Carmilla characters. Passion, survival, caring, compassion, absolutely. Which is quite different from our third movie we're going to talk about next, and that is 2019's Bliss. If you've noticed the trend, these are the triple threat of the B movies of the 2010s that were absolutely fantastic. So the synopsis for Bliss is as follows. In need of creative inspiration, a professionally stagnant and hard partying Los Angeles artist named Desi Donahue recklessly indulges in a series of drug binges. As the narcotics fly out of control, so does her newfound and inexplicable, yet unquenchable craving for blood. As someone who has never been able to control her vices in the first place, Desi is violently consumed by this bloodlust.
Yes. So Bliss is another film that I saw a couple years ago, just before Bit, that I absolutely loved because I was like, this is another great modern take on the female vampire. Because like we said before, we've been constantly getting these narratives of them being the brides, or we get those kick-ass, badass vampire slayers like Selena in the Underworld series. But this was another take on the female vampire that is also really interesting because while Clara and Duke are very strong and powerful, they are very well composed, they are very much in control, and they're very neat and clean in their kills, even though Duke has always got blood in her face with a cigarette in her mouth, which is pretty fucking hot. Desi is messy. She is an artist. She is all about using her vampiric origin to fuel her creativity and her lust to be able to find a legacy for herself, because she's reached a breaking point in her own career as an artist. And she needs inspiration. And we know that throughout the film, she's finding inspiration through heavy uses of drugs. She uses this form of cocaine called Diablo, and it just like goes wild and stuff like that. But then she meets up with her old friend, Courtney. And you can tell,
Courtney, those dangerous blondes, dangerous blondes.
She's a hard partier and stuff like that, but they have this interesting chemistry. They're, you can tell that Desi is probably bisexual, because you can tell that those two have been together in the past before, but have also had some sort of relationship. And they do end up in a menage a trois, you would say, and sharing blood in the sense of like Courtney bites Desi for the first time and she experiences a euphoria she's never felt before. But then she starts craving more and she wants more and more. And Desi undergoes his own transformation that is so empowering, but it's so overwhelming and so encompassing that she has no way to control it.
Absolutely. And I find with this one especially, it's just like old vampire films, like, obviously like 20s, 30s, 40s, like the Gothic Hammer films, the 70s, and in the 80s, things start to get a little hip. With like Near Dark and Lost Boys and a bit of the 90s things. You got Interview with the Vampire and Dracula. So things kind of go back to the Gothic kind of romance, but they're Gothic, they're moody, they're broody, they're atmospheric, they're still sexual, a lot of them. But Bliss is different because it's like very hip and cool, and like music is a huge factor in this. There's a lot of style, a lot of aesthetics. It's also highly, highly sexual. I wrote down neon indulgence. That is this movie, and it's so wonderful. But Desi, as our Carmilla character, absolutely, she's this artist. She lives alone. She drinks. She does drugs. She has casual sex. She has a lot of rage issues. She gets into fights. She's a hostile woman. I like her because I like those messy, kind of volatile women. But she's not generally like a likable, I'll put in quotations, folks, because that's kind of subjective and whatnot. Really, what is likable anyways, but quote unquote likable. Like Duke, I could see being like, I root for Duke, absolutely, but she's like just very cool,
Duke's
Clara's, yes, but Desi's just all over the place, right? She even says, like, after that first bite, that euphoria of everything, she says it was like I was possessed. And then she just like keeps rolling with this euphoria, and also the drugs that are given this euphoria. So she's kind of going back and forth of like, I'm loving these drugs and it's helping me create her latest like masterpiece, right? But she takes no shit. She's very work oriented. She's agitated. She's driven. I would say she channels the predatory nature of Carmilla, but our rebellious nature of Lilith.
Yes, I was going to say that. Yes, she is the dark side of Carmilla. Like she is the dark, messy side of being the female vampire, the very visceral side. Because there's even points in the original Carmilla story where Laura wakes up in the middle of the night and sees just Carmilla drenched in blood, or she'll make scenes of like this, you know, the ugliness of all of a sudden like Carmilla's face would look like rageful and stuff like that. And that is Desi. That is like when Desi starts going into her like vampiric form and her transformation, she is uncontrollable and she is sexual, but she is also a predatory, and like you said, she is that dark feminine energy, that dark side of the female vampire, that yes, they can be very cold, calculating, and collective, and can hold power on their own, but at the same time too, though, it can also be very wild and untamed, and
absolutely.
Yeah,
because in the end, they're still monsters. We're not saying female vampires aren't monsters. They're wonderful, inspiring monsters. But this is like, so Desi's kind of like our monstrous female vampire. The other two are, like you said, they have plans, they have goals, they have things they want to do, and it ends up being survival. But Desi isn't about that. She's just this free-spirited woman. And maybe it comes back to, you know, there's themes of, you know, vampirism as like a metaphor for addiction in this, which is not something we'll get into. That's a theme for another day. But, you know, there's that creativity, her bloodlust fuels her artistry and everything. But what's interesting is at one point in the movie, I think it's Clive, her lover, boyfriend, casual, whatever, her fling. He's like, Des, are you alive? And she says, barely. But then later on, close to the end of the movie, and it was him again, besides him saying like, what are you, the fucking Lost Boys? Which made me laugh. So I like when vampire movies exist in vampire movies. We get it. You're like, oh, I know this is a vampire. But he says to her, he's like, do you think it's the bliss or like the drugs or the blood? And she says, it's me.
Yes. Right. And that, both things, like in the sense of like, you know, the drug and the blood is kind of helping her connect to the source within her that's allowing her to break through those barriers and those walls. And often a lot of creative people feel that they feel blocked, they feel these barriers in the walls, and so they look for other things to kind of help break them open and they can move forward. For Desi, she had to go to the extent of becoming a vampire and drinking other blood, and then the art that she creates is this amazing figure of as these symbols of, you know, both Kelly and I watching the film, we've both seen Lilith, Baphomet, and we're like, this freedom of this expression of this, it almost looks like a hellscape picture, but at the same time too, there's so much power in it, this sense of very visceral energy, because even then when she's painting that scene, she's painting in literally blood in a viscera from having killed two other vampires who try to keep her in control. They're like, no, you are out of control. We need to like stop you. And she's like, no, I'm not done yet. I don't care if I die. I want my legacy to be in this painting. So at the end of the movie, she's dancing in blood and paint and a viscera. And you're like, this is amazing.
The ending's very frenetic. And I love that. But like Desi comes back to life in this movie. The vampirism, it's transformative. Again, she takes it to a very high octane, messy place, but she comes back to life metaphorically. It's just very erotic, but again, her agency, her power, like these female vampires don't just have supernatural power, but it's the power of knowing who you are and having confidence. And that's what these modern vampires have over our brides, who were literal like nothing. They were blank canvases. They were just nothing. They were just pretty girls, right? But this movie is a drug and blood fueled neon nightmare. And this, again, kind of Carmilla, like she's alluring, but also kind of repulsive. Yes, she's drenched in blood. She's ripping heads off. Like she's just jumping like a feral animal on people to kill. And she's out of control. The aspect of keeping, you know, vampires in any kind of movie is like, we can't be too overt because we want to actually keep killing humans and live our lives. So if you're out of control, that's going to tarnish it for the rest of us.
Yeah, exactly. And that was like through all three of these movies, and even the sense of like starting from the idea of Carmilla is this idea of transformation, becoming a vampire, or you know, in all their cases, they were able to transform and gave them the power and the abilities they didn't have before. And now is their decision on how they want to use those powers and abilities, right? And not allow themselves to be victims to other men again. And which is what we want to see in our Carmilla figure. Sadly, in our actual novel, Carmilla is sadly executed because she is found out and she is captured. But at the same time, too, though, we're not forgetting the type of narratives and tropes that she's left for other female vampires that we didn't see after that. Once we got Dracula, then we thought, oh, female vampires are always the subservient brides of the master, always. And then we go back to Carmilla, I'm like, wait, this female vampire, like, she was seductive, she was interesting, she talked, she was, very in control, she was able to kind of use mind games to get people to understand. And she's like, no, I'm just a sick woman, I'm fine. She had agency. And Absolutely. That's what we lost when we didn't get to see that. But now we're seeing that again with our female vampires.
Absolutely. And on this rewatch of Bliss, I noticed a really interesting thing about Desi's final painting. And I was like, this is very reminiscent of the Baphomet and relevant to tonight's talk through the Satanic Estate. We thought we'd briefly mention this because it was really interesting to me. So as we know, since 1856, the name Baphomet has been associated with the Sabbatic goat image drawn by Eliphas Levi. So that the Baphomet contains these binary elements or symbolism of an equilibrium of opposites: human, animal, male, female, good, and evil, right? A social order, like things being in control. And the arms of the Baphomet say solve or dissolve in Latin, or coagulate. So when it comes to Desi, I would say she sheds her old self to become a vampire, dissolves her old self, reforms as a vampire. And the Baphomet, is usually, from those uninformed, considered an evil or deviant kind of image, but really just about opposites: good, evil, like I said, man, woman, a deity that kind of represents some of the universe, and naturally opposing forces. So the Baphomet has the right hand up, left hand down. I'm in a video, you can't really see it. You all know this, folks. But in Desi's painting, it does the opposite. So the right hand is down, the left hand is up, but she also has a halo around her head. So it's the opposite. Is this a perversion of the iconic symbol? Is it a symbol of the state of mind or her state as a vampire? I don't know. Is she a savior? Is she a punisher? I'm not sure. It was very, very interesting.
That is really
What do you think, Jess?
Well, I remember when you brought that up, and I remember looking at that being like, yes, this is super interesting, seeing this idea of Desi reflecting this kind of opposite image of this equality, but this like nature and this balance and this duel between, I don't want to say like good and bad or, evil and good type thing, but you know what I mean? Because but bringing back to our more, to the connections of the more earthly nature of humanity, right? And that is another element of vampires, is they're more earthly. They're not creatures of supernatural, or they are creatures of supernatural, sorry, but they are just mean that they're more earthly because they are the undead. They are the ones who are walking around. They feed on the lifeblood of other humans and of other beings. They are of an earthly element, and thus, connected back to our original female vampire, as always, Lilith. Once again, another very earthly creature, and often used in a lot of vampire lore, and also in a lot of connection to Satan as well.
Yeah, so I'm not really sure exactly if the person, like Joe Bagos, who created this movie, if that was what was in his mind, but it's a really powerful ending image. And, there's these people like maybe crawling their way up to her. So that's where I think, like, is she a savior? The halo, and there's people coming up. Is vampirism our savior? Or is she coming to punish? Because throughout the entire movie, she's not really nice to people overall as a human, but as a vampire, she is just destroying everyone.
Well, people like demanding things of her, or wanting things, or just, I like that you bring that up, and I always want to go back and look at that imagery again and look at it more. Like, that painting in itself is just gorgeous, and I'm like, if I saw something like that, I would definitely feel empowered as a woman to be like,
I want it.
Yes, exactly.
If it's real, does it really exist? It must. I want it. Give it to me. So I don't know. Perversion, transformative vampires. What do you folks think? So this was reaching the end of our presentation today. But I wanted to leave at least one little quote about female vampires. The vampire holds up a mirror and shows us everything we want to deny and thrust aside. We become abject when we deny ourselves a full range of emotion that we are capable of. And we abject women when we deny them the full scope of motivation that they are capable of. So that ends our presentation on the monstrous female vampire, or the Rise of Carmilla. Thank you so much for joining us and watching us today. We would like to remind you to follow us on our website, spinstersofhorror.com. On all of social media, you can just type in Spinsters of Horror and you will find us. If you'd like to use Facebook, we have a Facebook group called the Spinsters of Horror Coven. Come hang out with us.
As well, we also have a Letterboxd account, so you can check out some of the movies that we watch for our podcast and the ratings that we give them. And we also have a YouTube page where we have past presentations that we've done for the Satanic Estate, the Final Girls Berlin Festival, and just other random videos that we've done talking about various elements and themes in horror films. And you can also catch our podcast, I Spit on Your Podcast, on all past podcasting apps. And so please, when you do find it, please go and give us some listens and rate and review us. So until then, remember,
the future of fear is female. So we have 10 minutes, perfectly on the nose, for questions, if anybody has those for us today. Great movies. If folks are still watching, I love these movies. We could talk forever about all of them because they're very wildly diverse and different films, but with similar themes throughout them. It's they are so fantastic. I didn't mention, but Byzantium was actually directed by Neil Jordan, who did Interview with the Vampire. So what a wonderful. Go ahead.
Which makes so much sense, because when you brought that up, I was like, okay, the elements of this movie, the whole story of Ella writing her story. I'm like, oh, she's our Louis character.
Yeah, there's a lot of similarities, but this is the female version of Interview with the Vampire. They have a lot of like similar kind of like atmosphere and mood. They're very beautifully done and like really great cinematography. So it's really interesting things. Anyways. Question. I wanted to ask if we could get a list of the movies you've talked about, as well as a link to a website you've mentioned. This was a direct message. I'm so sorry. So sorry. I've lost my mind. Yes. Satanic Estate. We can give you everything you would like from us. Would you like some blood? We will give that to you as well in my very satanic chalice here. Drinking blood.
Is that, it's like, well, I'm drinking wine because we don't drink, I quoted Dracula.
Yeah,
I don't drink wine.
I don't drink wine.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's so interesting going back, and for Kelly and I, we've been watching old horror movies from the 1920s and 30s, and it's just interesting going back watching the original Dracula and seeing the brides, and they're like so gorgeous and beautiful, and you're like, wow. I remember watching the first scenes of them coming out of their coffins, like, ooh, that is scary. But then they don't do anything. They don't do anything. They go to feed, and Dracula's like, no. And I'm just like,
get out of here.
Yeah, exactly. Like, I am so tired of this. And it's interesting because, like I was saying earlier, like in the early 2010s, and this is when Kelly and I like stumbled upon this, because Kelly had watched A Girl Comes Alone at Night. A Girl
Walks Home Alone at Night.
Thank you. A Girl Walks Home Alone at Night. And I had watched Byzantium, and we started talking. We're just like, wow, there seems to be like a certain time period where all of a sudden female vampires are not these brides. They have agency. They have control. They're literally fighting up against the patriarchy. And I know that I'm just like kind of talking to Cole about some space, but it was just this really interesting idea that came out, that all of a sudden these vampires are changing. And I know we've got a couple new movies coming out in the future with the same idea of female vampires having more agency and not being under the thumbs of some master.
Absolutely. So it doesn't look like there are any questions. I don't know. Should we just end it here? What do you think, moderator? We can leave it for a couple more minutes, but
well, it looks like there is a question in the chat.
Excellent.
Was Christabel an influence on Camilla?
Oh, that's a great question. And that name rings a bell, but I couldn't really comment on that.
That is, I remember that from a very long time ago. That's an old story about a vampire, but I will confidently not say anything like yes or no to that. I want to go and revisit that, because earlier when I have this giant tome of like old vampire literature and a lot of female vampires in there, and there was a lot of like essays and articles discussing Christabel, discussing Bathory and Carmilla, and I was like, I need to go back and revisit this, and I wish I had.
It was a great question, but I can't answer that one. But it is a familiar story in my mind. I've not read it, but I have heard of it, but I'm not sure. I'm also not sure when it came out. So thank you. I'm sorry that we couldn't answer that one.
Okay. There is another question from our dear Christoph. He would like to know, can Anne Rice be included in the vein of feminist vampirism?
Actually, I was earlier just thinking about that, because one of the reasons why I got really interested in the agencies of female vampires is Claudia as a character, because her arc as a vampire, you know, being a young female vampire at the same time too, she's looking for agency, she's looking to be a woman, and she also technically has a lot of power and control within that dynamic with the men, even though at times they're like, no, you're just a child and we're just gonna treat you like a child. She's like, no, I'm a woman and I have some agency, even though I may be in the body of that of a child. And there's also other female vampires throughout the Anne Rice novels, and I'm blanking on, not Pandora, but there is Marius has a companion who is a female vampire that we see later on, as she's like kind of part of that coven of ancient vampires when we see I was gonna say Queen of the Damned when she rises. I'm blanking on the name when she rises again, but there's a bunch of different female vampires who come and they say like, no, they live on their own, they live very solitary lives and they have their own power and agency. So yeah, I would include Anne Rice in that. In terms of literature, yes, I would.
I haven't read Anne Rice since I was a goth teenager, so from my recollection, besides Claudia, I couldn't remember any woman that really would stand out. There are a lot of quite male-centric vampire stories.
There's two books that I've read that had like two female vampire characters that are not the queen, who had their own stories and their own roles and agency.
Besides Akasha.
Akasha,
you don't really get tons on. Yes,
no, you get more. You get more of Akasha in in the books.
I actually had a question for both of you.
Yes.
I am a huge admirer of the good and the bad in the world of vampirism, where it's either the great Bella Blasco to George Hamilton in the Disco Vampire film, which I am a huge fan of. But I wanted to ask you, what is your favorite Count Dracula film and why?
My favorite iteration of a classic Dracula cinematically is actually, and I can never remember the actor's name, but it's actually the Dracula in the Monster Squad. He has the classic outfit.
Excellent.
He is mean. He wants to kill children. He brings all of the monsters together. I love his version of the classic cinematic Dracula. Like, he's like the 80s Bela Lugosi with that kind of garb. But I also enjoy the Gary Oldman.
Oh yeah, I was gonna say, I'm like,
I grew up with him.
We grew up with Gary Oldman as Dracula, that sexy, monstrous one. But I know later on in years when I see Christopher Lee as Dracula, same idea. He's very attractive, and you're like, ooh, I cannot resist him. But he is like also very monstrous, and you're just like, and that's what I like. I like it when I see my vampires that are also sexy but also monsters at the same time too.
We definitely have that with the Gary Oldman one. But it's like highly romantic, and then like highly monstrous because he's like a literal bat monster thing.
That terrified me as a child.
Yeah, I understand that for sure, for sure. So he was a little bit different. He was kind of his own thing, but
cool.
Yeah.
And I wanted to say too, I used to host, hope to again in the future, a movie night in Atlanta, and we had one of the nights was the Monster Squad, and had so much feedback from people, exactly what you said, that I don't remember his name, but like one of the lineage of Bram Stoker, of all the vampire films, he felt that was the most representative of the story. And I was like, I had no idea. So I always remember that when people gush about Monster Squad, I'm like, you have to see this. You know, it's not Frank Langella, it's this. So go watch it.
Yeah. Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely. He just has that like air of aristocrat. Oh God.
Mm.
Being an aristocrat, it's just
Yeah.
like the classic kind of Dracula character that you would get, but he's mean as hell.
Yes. Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah,
I
he's
just
very cold for a kids movie, kind of.
Oh
So,
yeah, it's not really a
it's good
kids
fun.
movie. Yes. it did like
Yeah.
there's a line that it goes back and forth over it.
Yeah. Yeah, I agree.
Yeah.
Let's see. I don't think we have any other questions, but someone, Luna, thank you. She gushed about Love at First Bite as well. That's the one I remember most, next to like, Bela Lugosi's movies and all that kind of stuff. Like, I just love George Hamilton and that song, so I'm going to be a dork and say that's enough about that.
I haven't actually
That's
seen that
awesome.
movie. That sounds fun though.
It's amazing. It's got like Paula Prentice and Artie Feldman, and it's like disco, like late 70s. It's like
Ooh.
honestly, it's so much fun, and I totally recommend it.
I'll give a
Totally.
shout out to Blackula actually, because holy moly, that man is sexy.
Yes.
Yes.
Yes,
Sorry. You talk about 70s, you're talking about disco, and there's like a lot of that kind of like psychedelic kind of going to the nightclub vibe in Blackula. And I watched that recently, like last year, and I really, really enjoyed it. So shout out to Blackula as well.
Awesome. I'd like to give a shout out too. It's not necessarily about Count Dracula, but Vamp with Grace Jones
Yes.
was also an amazing vampire film that I always recommend as well.
Yeah, I love vampire movies. It's definitely something that Jess and I bond over and agree on. We both grew up with vampire books and movies, and we love them. And we love when we see like really interesting ones that kind of take things in a different direction, subvert
Exactly.
a lot of these tropes, just do fun things, because like you can do so many different things with vampirism. So show us this. And like, yeah, the good and the bad, I just like vampire stories. Let the Right One In is also in like my top 5 very different, interesting Scandinavian vampire movie. I love that one a lot. It's very different. Yeah, Girl Walks Home Alone at Night. Very cool, very different. That's also 2010s. Like we had like this resurgence of tons of these really interesting female vampires and just like general vampire movies. So it was ripe for the picking for discussion.
Yes. Right.
Yeah.
Well, I'm not seeing any other questions in the chat. Just everybody's throwing out like these wonderful movies like Blackula and Once Bitten and Jefferson Twilight, Blackula Hunter, which I've never heard of before that I'm gonna watch.
Wow, no, there's so many. There's so many again, great, like to discover like little indie films that you just wouldn't know. Yeah.
Definitely. Very cool. And then, of course, there's also like Prince of Darkness, done by John Carpenter, and then someone mentioned Vampires with John Wood or James Woods. So there's just it's like ice cream. There's a different flavor of vampire for everybody.
Absolutely,
for sure.
That is such a great way to
30 Days of Night.
Yes, I just watched that recently. Ooh,
I
love that one.
You want really monstrous vampires that are literally just feral beasts? Oh God, yes, I love that.
My other shout out is to the severely underrated indie gem called Stakeland that nobody ever talks about, that I am obsessed with, by Jim Mickle.
It is quite lovely, yeah.
Yeah, those are literal monstrous vampires.
Yeah.
And there's like a vampire plague, and it's a post-apocalyptic. It's fascinating, heartbreaking, excellent movie.
Excellent.
But yeah, ice cream flavors. There's so many different types of vampire movies. Absolutely.
Very much so. I think the film was called Daybreakers.
Yeah.
It was with Sam Neill. Like I always think about that film and Blade. That concept, they're just food.
Blade. Yes.
And then you watch Daybreakers and you're like, so what do you do when you eat all the food and you're the only ones that are left? Here's the movie to show this. So I thought it was quite interesting.
I love that. Yeah.
And I love the idea of like the kind of like biological warfare of it all. That idea of it, I think, is really fascinating. Very
so many. Oh my God, Blade. Don't even. Oh my God. Grew up with that one. Also, that would be in my top 10. Oh, it's just so cool. Just so
Yeah.
cool.
I would throw in Blade too because I love Parker Posey and her Chihuahua, and all of that between Ryan Reynolds and Parker Posey I think is amazing,
Yeah.
and I watch that quite often sometimes.
Nice.
But yeah, it's a great film.
There's so many wonderful things. I don't think I've met a vampire movie I didn't like, or I was like, this is actually terrible. I hate this. Like, never. I know Jess hates John Carpenter's vampires. It's like really kind of gross at times, but I know she definitely doesn't like that one. But I had a really good time with that. Valak is such a sweet vampire. It's like cowboy Western
vampire,
vampires.
but I just can't.
Jess isn't good with misogyny.
If I want Western vampires, I watch Near Dark.
Right. Fair enough.
Yeah.
Like I don't watch John Carpenter's vampires regularly, but again, don't hate it. I'll find merit in any vampire movie. Give it to me.
Right. Well, I think that's it for us.
I would say so.
Well, thank you again for joining us. It was a wonderful chat, and I very much enjoyed it. So thank you.
Thank you.
Oh,
thank you for having us. Seriously, again, we haven't said no yet. So if you got anything else coming up, like let us know, because we actually have been really loving the subject matter that we're choosing for these, and like we just can kind of like go in on like a really specific kind of topic. So I love that because you kind of help guide us with something that we can talk about. So yeah, we love this. So we'd happily come back.
Yes, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you, and we're honored to have you, and everyone that's joined us tonight for the discussion. We're very glad that you're here as well. And happy Halloween, y'all.
Happy Halloween, everyone.
See ya.
Bye. See ya. Bye. All right. Cool.